Hi everyone. Today I want to talk about 5 mistakes that you should avoid when you're writing your literature review. Now, you can find my lesson that includes all you need to know about writing a literature review for your dissertation or your thesis in my complete academic writing and research course, which is linked in the video description. So let's go ahead and get started with a bit of a review of what a literature review actually is. Remember, our literature review is not just a list of summaries. We want to talk about what's been done in the field, and we want to connect this to our existing research, to the study that we're going to do. So we're eventually going to funnel down to where we get to the gap in the literature that our study is going to fill. Now, I always tell my students, think of your literature review as a conversation between you and the scholars that came before you. Remember, as you're writing your master's or as you're writing your doctoral dissertation, what you're doing is you're joining the academic community and you're standing on the shoulders of the scholars that have come before you. So think of this as a social practice. So your literature review is going to be your second chapter. In your first chapter, you've talked about the need for your study. You've talked about the aims, what you're going to accomplish. Now you need to exhaust all the previous literature and you want to end with the gap in the literature that your study is going to fill. And it's going to look something like this. Think about that funnel structure. You're going to start with that big picture overview of the field. Then you're going to get down to a more focused view and even further focused until you arrive at that gap. You're going to highlight any contested findings in the literature, and you're also going to highlight any areas that you intend to explore further in your research. So let's get started then with some mistakes that we want to avoid. The first is overlooking foundational research. So much of what we do when we're writing our dissertation or we're writing our thesis involves that focus. We want to really niche down to where we're narrowly focused on one topic that we are going to study. However, we don't want to ignore seminal works in our field. We want to think about the works that underpin our research. We want to think about key concepts that relate to our study and what the historical development or the scholarly development of those ideas have been. So we need to trace that back, and that can start out at the top of that funnel as we get closer down towards the gap in our literature. And we want to make sure that we touch on critical shifts in theory or in paradigm that exist in the field of study or in the theory that's underpinning our research, our dissertation. So we want to make sure that we touch on all those intellectual debates. Next, we want to avoid the echo effect. In other words, we don't want to just choose literature that supports our position. So cherry picking sources that zero in on our preconceived notion, we're going to be challenged by that by our committee. Your dissertation or your thesis is probably going to get sent back for review because your chair, who is an expert in that field, is going to tell you you missed all of these studies, right? We want to acknowledge contradictory findings, things that present alternative perspectives. That is what we are going to hopefully challenge with our study, if that's the aim of your research. We also want to highlight the limitations of certain studies, and those limitations might be what's creating a gap for our study. The summary trap, I talked about this earlier. We don't want to simply summarize or list the previous studies that have been done. It's not a chronological approach to all the previous articles or books that have been written. We want to synthesize the research. We want to talk about themes in the literature that follows with that funnel approach. We're basing that funnel around big themes in the literature, and we're looking to create that overarching narrative. Remember, it's that scholarly conversation that we're having with our peers in the academic community. And very often, because our literature review is most likely the longest chapter of our dissertation, sometimes if you're doing a qualitative study, you might have a very extensive results chapter, but your literature review is going to be fairly vast. And given its vastness, you don't want to lose focus. So you may be tempted to include everything. And you do want to exhaust the literature, but you want to make sure that you avoid including irrelevant studies. The studies that you choose to include should directly address your research question. Remember, you're starting out with that very broad focus, but it's got to eventually narrow down to where you're just focusing on your topic and on your question. So you don't want to give a very superficial overview. And there are boundaries to your literature review, and you don't want your reader to go in and for your reader to struggle to define what those boundaries are. So you have to set those boundaries as the author. And smooth citations. This is really important and something that we don't really think about very often, but it has a big impact on our literature review. We usually think about making sure that we conform to whatever style guide our university requires us to, but we don't think about how our style of writing impacts the narrative nature of whatever it is we're writing. Because someone is going to be reading this, and we want it to be something that is both informational and enjoyable for them to read. So we want to be consistent with our style. We want to make sure that we're not making any errors. We also don't want to be over-reliant on direct quotes. We want to synthesize that information. Remember, when you use a quotation, you have to make sure you interpret that quotation. Never end a paragraph in your literature review with a direct quotation. Make sure that we're properly integrating sources into our writing. Otherwise, our writing is going to come across as being disjointed. All right, you did a great job. Thank you for staying with me for those 5 things that you're going to want to avoid in your literature review for your dissertation or your thesis. And again, you can find my complete academic writing and research course linked in the video description. And I'll see you in our next video here at the Language Arts Gallery.